a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Star Theatre. Wow, what an audience. Are you feeling well? Good. I mean, I have to tell you, I would call you the professionals. I've even lost my heels. I do apologize, but safety first. It always says one hand for yourself, one hand for the ship. I don't know, I'll try. I think you made one person very happy by coming to the most moving part of the ship today, and that's my very, very dear Bruce Petty. He's smiling like you can see. So thank you so much for coming along today. I know it is moving, and this is unfortunately really the part where a ship is always moving the most. You're at the very front of our ship, so I hope you'll be fine. At the moment, it's still fine. So anyhow, without a long talk here, I've had the pleasure of working with this wonderful man already last voyage. You joined us here, and I really would like. He doesn't really like me doing that, but I really would like to give him a little introduction because you deserve it. So Bruce is a US Navy veteran of the Vietnam War, to start with. And he served on board the USS Yorktown CVS-10 as an aviation ordnanceman. So I think that deserves an applause at this stage. And up to now, I mean, you have just an abundance of energy. You might see Bruce every morning, and no matter what the weather is, actually pacing up and down is it the forward staircase?
The forward staircase.
Forward staircase, so the staircase you just came from. He's doing, literally running up and down the stairs with two very heavy weights. So there you go. Anyone wants to join him, he does this for a whole hour. I'm out of this, yes. So any of you who may be indulging too much on the ice cream, you might want to join him tomorrow. But besides that, also following his return, he earned a degree in history from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he's also written, he said 5 books by now, yes, indeed, on the Pacific War, along with a number of magazines and numerous journals as well. So he has so much, a wealth of knowledge, and I really hope you will enjoy what he has to give and offer you. So without further ado, please give it up to our Bruce Petty. To the stage.
Okay, thank you. I gather most of you are from North America, is that correct? North America, I've met a couple of Canadians. Est-ce qu'il est les Français ici ou non? Pas de français? Okay, it was my second language. I guess I won't be able to use it on this cruise then. Okay, yeah. So, I better move along here. Anyway, I'm going to keep a little bit of social distancing, at least for the first few days, and wear a mask because, I don't know, maybe somebody brought the bubonic plague on board, or worse, laryngitis. I've been on 2 cruises where I picked up the laryngitis and couldn't lecture for about 3 days. So, now, when I first started lecturing, basically, I based my lectures on the research and the oral history interviews I've done with the World War II generation. I've interviewed not only military personnel from the United States, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. I've also interviewed people from the civilians, because I think the home front figures prominently in what happened during those years. Also, having lived in the Mariana Islands for 5 years, where I researched and wrote my first book, I started doing oral history interviews with a lot of Micronesians, because if you think about it, the war, for the most part, was not fought in Japan or the United States, except for the bombing of Pearl Harbor, some fighting in the Aleutians, and then, of course, the last year of the war when the B-29s took the war home to the Japanese homelands. But for the most part, the war was fought in somebody else's real estate, the Melanesians, the Micronesians, and I'll go a little bit more into that with some of my future lectures here. But then after I'd done this for a while, I thought, well, I should put together an introductory lecture as to the events that led up to World War II, and more specifically, the Pacific War, because it's not as if the Japanese just woke up one morning and decided they were going to bomb Pearl Harbor and see what we would do about it. There's a little bit more involved in that. And I guess it depends. If you had maybe 10 different military historians up here, you might get a slightly different version of some of the events that led up to World War II. For example, if you were a Eurocentric military historian, you might say, well, World War II started in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland. But I'm going to go back a little bit further because World War II was not just in Europe. It was literally a world war. It encompassed the globe, including Asia and the Pacific. And I just use this photograph as an introductory. This is taken on Naftan Point, which is the southern most tip of the island of Saipan. That's where I lived for 5 years. That's where I researched and wrote my first book. And what you're looking at is an old Japanese gun revetment down there. And that's me before I had gray hair, but I'm wearing a hat, so you don't even know. But I'm going to go all the way back to the early 17th century to the Tokugawa shogunate and work up through the Meiji Restoration. I'm going to explain both here in a little bit. But see, Japan, prior to the shogunate, was going through a very difficult period of civil unrest. There were a lot of clans in Japan, and they were fighting each other for dominance. So it was a very unsettled period. It was very difficult to be living there, especially if you're a peasant and trying to survive when there's this constant fighting going around. But finally, in the early 1600s, the Tokugawas, they pretty much came through on top. They dominated all the other clans. They instituted a period of relative peace and prosperity to the point where the samurai really didn't have much to do. A lot of them pretty much hung their swords up and got involved in agriculture or academics or some other line of work. But the Tokugawas were so strict that just about any infraction of the law could get you in a lot of trouble. For a lot of these, what we would think are minor infractions of the law could be result in your death. They were so strict that they did not allow anybody onto the island who was not Japanese, and if you were Japanese, you were not allowed to leave those islands unless you had special permission, and that was very rare. In fact, to leave the islands, even if you were, for example, a fisherman, a Japanese fisherman, and you were caught in a storm and you were blown onto foreign shores. There were examples, recorded examples of fishermen from Japan who actually were blown over to North America and then ended up over in the Pacific Northwest before they were rescued and eventually brought back. But it could be dangerous because even though you left the country by accident, the fact is you left without permission. So there are instances where people, Japanese trying to get back to their home islands, actually had to sneak in so the authorities wouldn't know about it. Likewise, if you were a foreign fisherman, for example, and you became wrecked on the Japanese home islands, you couldn't report to your embassy and ask to be repatriated because there were no foreign embassies in that time. Now, the closest thing to that was the shogunate decided that they wanted at least a window on the outside world. So they allowed the Portuguese initially to come in and do a little bit of training, but at the same time, the Portuguese would bring in information on what was going on in the outside world. The only problem with the Portuguese is, though, that they also brought in Jesuit missionaries. And initially, the shogunate allowed these Jesuits to come in, and they were proselytizing. And then after a while, they thought, well, you know, this could be a very threat to our culture here if we let these missionaries go. They had some success. They made some converts, but they were afraid that this new religion just might prove to be a threat. So they got rid of the Portuguese. Matter of fact, some of the Jesuits were actually executed because they didn't want to leave. And a lot of the converts were forced to renounce their newfound religion, that or face death. And so some did, and for a long time, Christianity in Japan went underground. So they got rid of the Portuguese, and the Dutch came in, because the Dutch by this time had a more secular background and secular thinking. They were not interested in saving heathen souls. They were more interested in making a guilda. So they got the Portuguese out. brought the Dutch in. But even then, they thought, well, we're not going to let them just trade up and down the coast. We're going to confine them to Nagasaki Harbor. Not only were they confined to Nagasaki Harbor, they built this little man-made island that was connected to the mainland just by a footbridge. Now, this is a mock-up of it, but I've been there. You can walk from one end to Dejima in about 5 minutes. So this is where the Dutch were confined. They carried on a little bit of trading, but they brought in information, about those. Well, the Japanese became aware quite on about the science and technology that was going on, the advances that were being made in science and technology in the Western world. And what really frightened them was some of the military advances that were being made in the Western world. So they were aware of this, and especially as we get into the 18th century, when Western imperialism and colonialization started spreading around the globe, especially when it got to Asia. When the British took Hong Kong, the opium wars that were going, 2 opium wars that were fought in China, and then others like the French and the Germans that came along, because China had become quite weak at that time. The emperor system was corrupt. It's gone through these cycles throughout the history of China. But the Westerners came in during a period when they just didn't have that much control. And plus, like the Japanese, the Chinese didn't have the industrial and technological capacity that some of the Western nations had at this time. And even today, China refers to roughly the middle of the 18th century until the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949 as a century of humiliation. Because the British started bringing in opium, they got the Chinese addicted to that, and the Chinese had to pay in silver. So it was very profitable. And then other Western countries, even the United States got involved, individuals in the United States got involved in the opium trade. In fact, President Roosevelt's maternal grandfather, Delano, he made part of his fortune as a drug dealer in China. So the Japanese were aware of this, and they were becoming quite nervous. And they became even more nervous when this gentleman came along, Commodore Matthew C. Perry of the United States Navy. Because the United States had politely, over in the previous part of the century, had tried to open trade with Japan. The Japanese authorities refused it. They said, okay, we'll make a big deal of it. The Russians tried, the British tried. And then finally in 1850s, he sailed uninvited into Tokyo Harbor and announced that he had arrived by firing off the ship's cannons. He got a hold of some of the authorities from the shogunate and said, I think you've been in isolation long enough. It's time to open up a little bit. And he says, I'm going to sail away for a while. I'll give you time to think about it. When I come back, I want your answer. Oh, this was quite a dilemma for the Japanese because they'd been very successful in maintaining their isolationism for several centuries. So there was a lot of debate going on in the shogunate. Matter of fact, by the time later in the 1860s, when the United States was involved in the Civil War, Japan was having their own little civil war. I think it was called the Boshin Wars, because there was a big struggle. Should we resist these long-nosed foreigners who are trying to force their way into our country, or should we let them come in and then try to hold them at some distance so that we don't end up the way China has ended up? And so this period afterwards, you get into the 1860s, when the United States was involved in their own civil strife. Well, the Japanese were going through something similar, but for a different reason. But once it was settled, they decided, and it's called the Meiji Restoration after the emperor at that time, and they pretty much concluded after the fighting that, the only way we're going to survive in a situation like this and not end up like China is if we imitate the West. And imitate them in terms of industrialization, in terms of modernizing our military, and being in a situation where hopefully we can be on the par with the Western powers without ending up being humiliated, as was the case in China. So they sent young men throughout the world to study foreign languages, study what was going on in Europe, study what's going on in the United States. They invited foreigners, especially American educators, and even allowed some missionaries in during the second half of the 19th century. As a result of this, they concluded that the Royal Navy probably had the best navy in the world, and so they decided that they were going to build a modern navy and a modern merchant marine following along the lines of the Royal Navy. So they invited Royal Naval officers and ratings to come to Japan. They paid them quite well, and their job was to train Japanese to become a modern naval power. Not only that, well into the first part of the 20th century, most of the ships that the Japanese bought were built in UK shipyards. Matter of fact, the last last Japanese warship purchased from the British was in 1913. That's just on the eve of World War I. So literally, within a generation, maybe 2 generations, they had their own modern navy, and they were able to start building their own ships. They were no longer completely dependent on the Royal Navy. Now, they also concluded from some of the men coming back that the French probably had the best army in the world. So they invited French army officers and enlisted personnel to come and help train a modern Japanese army. But this all changed in 1870. Does anybody know what happened in 1870 to change their mind? It was the Franco-Prussian War. Napoleon III, who was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, I think he was elected to office. I think it was in the 1840s. He liked being there, so at the end of his term, he decided not to leave. Sound familiar? No names. Anyway, so he declared himself emperor, just like his nephew had, and he stuck around, and he did a lot of good things for France. I mean, the Paris you know today is a result of Napoleon III, because he brought this guy in from, Bordeaux, Haussmann. I guess you could call him an urban planner, because Paris in those days was just a hovel of small streets, very unsanitary. He brought this guy, and he pretty much just rebuilt Paris the way you know it today. So before Napoleon III and Haussmann, it was a completely different city. But at the same time, Prussia, later to become Germany, they were starting to unite under Bismarck, and they were becoming a military power of their own. And the French and the Germans had been at each other's throats for a while over these 2 provinces on the French side of the Rhine called Alsace and Lorraine. And Bismarck decided, it's time to take those 2 provinces back from the French. So he invaded France through Sedan, which is up in the northeast part of France. Napoleon III went off to meet him, and not only did he get his butt kicked, but he got captured and was a prisoner of war. Bismarck then marched on Paris, surrounded it, and starved them into submission. You know how the French are. They like their food, and they got tired of eating rats after a while. So they surrendered, and the deal was that the French had to pay an indemnity to the Germans before they would move all of their troops out of France. And of course, the French, like any other nationality, they have their pride, and they seethe about this. Germany was the new enemy, and someday they were going to get even. But the Japanese, and seeing what happened, decided that the French probably didn't have a very good army after all, so they kicked the French out and brought in Germans. And so right up until the end of World War II, the Japanese army was modeled after the Prussian or the German model. Now, Japan had become so successful in modernizing. They started building their own ships. They had their own banking system. They were imitating the West in just about every way, shape, and form. They even formed a representative form of government, something they had no history and tradition of. They put together a form of government modeled on the British. They had a parliament, they had members of parliament, they had a prime minister. Overall, though, was the emperor. That was the titular head of the government. And so by the end of the century, we're talking about just one generation. They had become so, their military had become so powerful and successful that they decided they were going to imitate the West in another way. They were going to become a colonial power itself. So they came up with some trumped-up charge to go to war with China. They went to war with China. It ended really fast, and like the British and the Germans, they decided they were going to carve out little spheres of influence on China. Because, see, Japan had nothing in the way of natural resources. They still don't. They had a little bit of coal, no petroleum. By the time we're getting into the 20th century, the population had exploded. Not only because of industrialization and modernization, but better health care. They couldn't even, by this time, they couldn't even feed their population. So they were dependent on the importation not only of natural resources, but also foodstuffs. So they did that right at the end of the 19th century, and then a few years later, they got in a war with a European power. That was Tsarist Russia. Because by this time, the Trans-Siberian Railroad had been completed all the way over to Vladivostok, therefore uniting the Russian continent all the way over there. And then under the Tsar, they got even more ambitious. They started moving down in through Manchuria, even got into Korea. And with that blue circle, that was a place called Fort Arthur. They were down there. The Japanese said, this is our sphere of influence. We've carved out a little niche over here on the Asian mainland, and now you're coming in, and I don't think that's a good idea. They tried to talk with the Russians, say, maybe you should back off a little bit. But the Tsar said, well, who are you? You're just another little pipsqueak Asian country. Why should we listen to you? So the Japanese decided, well, we can't stand for this. So what they did is they launched a sneak attack against the Russian Asiatic Fleet, which was right off the coast there around Port Arthur, and they used a new type of weapon. It was a very stealthy weapon. It's called the torpedo. The torpedo had been invented and used successfully earlier in the 19th century, and this is before submarines, but they had torpedo boats, and some of their larger ships also carried torpedoes. So there was quite a battle going on the waters around there, and the Japanese came on top. They sunk almost all the Russian ships that are out there. So the Tsar decided to send his Baltic fleet all the way around the world to teach this upstart Asian nation a lesson. Well, what the Japanese Navy simply did was wait in the Tsushima Straits there where the blue arrow is. They waited there with their Navy. The Tsar's fleet sailed all the way around the world, sailed right into the Tsushima Straits, and got blown completely out of the water. It was one of the most complete naval defeats in naval history. And President Theodore Roosevelt at the time negotiated a peace between Japan and Russia, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize for 1905 for having accomplished that. But at the same time, the Americans and some of the other powers in the area become a bit concerned about Japan because it was no longer isolated. Okay, great, they opened up for trade, but look what they did. They've got a modern navy, a modern army. They carved out a sphere of influence on the Asian mainland. They defeated Russia in a major conflict. And going back as far as you want and right up to the present day, most nations have contingency plans for a possible war with some potential enemy. I don't think you need me to tell you that right now the United States and our allies, they have a contingency plan for a war with Russia. We have one for a possible war with China and North Korea. Being in North America, I think it's fair to say we have a contingency plan for war with Mexico, one of our nearest and probably less stable nations in that part of the world, although I'm beginning to wonder we might not be so stable either sometimes. But anyway, starting at the very end of the 19th century, the United States started putting together what is referred to as War Plan Orange. And orange is the code name for the Japanese. Blue would be the code name for the United States. And this changed and evolved right into the 20th century. Matter of fact, it was still being tweaked right up until Pearl Harbor. And a lot of the changes that went into War Plan Orange as the 20th century evolved had to do with the advances made in military technology. Because if you think back to World War I, they started using submarines, especially the Germans, used them most effectively, almost starving the United Kingdom into giving up the war in World War I. Airplanes were being used then. But they were made of wood and fabric. They were held together with glue and wire. They couldn't fly very high, very far. They couldn't carry much of a load. You could almost knock them down with a rock. But in just a generation later, between the end of World War I and World War II, look at the advances. I mean, submarines were built better and bigger, and torpedo technology had improved. Airplanes went from wood and fabric to aluminum frames, aluminum skin. They could fly higher, farther, carry a bigger bomb load. Matter of fact, there's a group of military aviators who fought in World War I and stayed between the wars and helped modernize aviation. They were referred to as the bomber mafia. There weren't that many of them, but they were the ones who went from wood and fabric to aluminum frames, aluminum skin, four-engine bombers. But they had all these theories about how the bomber would win the next war. You wouldn't even need an army because they would fly to some enemy cities, they would obliterate them and force them into surrender. Of course, this is a nice theory, and obviously it didn't work out that way. So this was War Plan Orange, and like I said, it was changed, it was tweaked, it was they changed it to meet the situation as they saw it arising as we got into the 20th century. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but Japan was an ally in World War I. They had a secret treaty at the time signed in 1902 with the British because the British had their own contingency plans for possible war in Europe. They thought there was a real possibility that they might end up in war with either Russia or Germany within the coming years. They knew that if they got in a major conflict on the European continent, they would not have the wherewithal to protect their assets in other parts of the world. So they signed this treaty with Japan to say, if we go to war with Russia or Germany, will you make sure nothing happens to our assets here, like Hong Kong and some of the other port cities where they had an influence. So the Japanese were an ally. They were smart enough not to send troops to get slaughtered in the trenches. But they did have a navy. They did some anti-submarine patrols. They also escorted the Anzacs from Australia to Gallipoli in 1916. Now, most of Micronesia and Melanesia had been Spanish until the Spanish-American War. That was 1898. With the completion of that war, the United States took the Philippines as a colonial possession. We wanted to be like the big boys in Europe. We wanted to have some colonies too, so we took the Philippines. We also took Guam in the Mariana Islands, and it's still a U.S. territory. And the reason we took Guam at that time is because ships were coal-fired. And if you didn't have coaling stations along the way, then you had to take your coal with you on ships called colliers. So we took Guam. And Spain was bankrupt by then. So the following year, in 1899, they sold all of their Micronesia to the Germans. And the Germans went in there and exploited it for economic reasons, growing copra and stuff like that. So with the Japanese as an ally, in 1914, the Japanese just swept down and they kicked the Germans out. They didn't have to fire a shot. They just acquired all of these little islands in Micronesia. And then with the Treaty of Versailles, the Japanese were allowed to stay there and keep these former German possessions under a Class C mandate under the old League of Nations. The idea was, though, you were supposed to administer in them, but you couldn't militarize them. And, of course, the French were looking for their pound of flesh after having been humiliated by the Germans in 1870 with the help of the British and then eventually the United States. They finally beat the Germans in World War I. They signed the Treaty of Versailles. Now, part of the Treaty of Versailles was that the Germans had to accept blame for the war, where something like 20 million people died. 20 million people, okay? And they also had to pay an indemnity. So a lot of historians now who study especially World War II pretty much credit the Treaty of Versailles with being the reason for World War II, just a generation later. So you have to ask your question, at least I, as a military historian, have to ask the question, was the Treaty of Versailles really a treaty or was it truce? Now here's another way I look at it, and you're not going to find this in the history books. Well, my theory is they just ran out of young men to send off to battle. We killed them all. There weren't enough left to keep the war going. So look at it this way. When your son was born, did you look down at him and think, well, I just think in 20 years I can send him off to war? I don't think you did. I don't think women of that generation were thinking the same thing. But basically, I think the Treaty of Versailles was just a truce. We needed the women of the world to produce more men so that 20 years down the road we could go back and do it all over again. What a wonderful idea. At the same time, the Japanese, having been an ally, they requested that a clause be put in the Treaty of Versailles saying that there would be racial equality now because the Japanese saw them as a major player. They helped out the Allies in World War I, so we should be recognized as equals. And you know what? The signers of Versailles, the Americans, the French, the British, they refused that clause. So that really embittered the Japanese. We're not equal players. After everything we've done, it was, thank you, ma'am, now you go back to your business. Now, there's also the Great Depression. Now, in the Great Depression, which affected not only the United States, it affected Australia, New Zealand, and Europe. People lost their homes, they lost their livelihoods, they lost their self-respect, families broke up, and a lot of individuals, not just in Europe and the United States, were toying with the idea of fascism and communism because they had pretty much concluded that capitalism doesn't work. Otherwise, why would we have lost everything that we've been working for all these years? So I think the Great Depression had a lot to do with the coming of World War II. And it's even worse in other places. Like in Japan, I had read that during the Depression, where you have a lot of villages that are completely dependent on one certain thing, like the production of silkworms. Now, during the Depression, well, the market fell out from the silk industry, and all of these villages went bankrupt. Now, according to one book I had read years ago, in Japan alone, something like 200,000 young women and girls were sold into prostitution by their families because they couldn't afford to feed them, even though it was against the law. Then, you see, the Japanese and the Americans had very cordial relationships, especially during the Meiji Restoration, right into the 20th century. We were sending over people to Japan, educators, government advisors, people in industry to help them modernize and be a successful modern nation. And the Japanese initially were sending students over the United States and diplomats. But then as we get towards the 20th century, the population of Japan had exploded. And some poor Japanese were going to places like Hawaii, even before it was annexed by the United States, just to work in the pineapple and sugarcane industry. The Chinese had been brought over right after the Civil War to help with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Japanese were following in large numbers too. Not students, not diplomats, but people looking for work. And so people became paranoid, especially on the West Coast, especially in California. So in 1924, they passed what's called the Japanese Exclusion Law. And that really turned things upside down in terms of any friendly feelings that both the United States and the Japanese had towards each other. On the West Coast of the United States especially, you heard about the Yellow Peril. Here come the Chinese, here come the Japanese, they're going to take over the place. We've got to keep them out. You can't come in, you can't own land. You have to, the ones that are here, they have to go to separate schools. That's how bad it was. I think if this hasn't been passed, though, I just kind of wonder sometimes what would have evolved after that in terms of relations between the United States. Now, in Japan in the 1920s and 1930s, this was government by assassination. Like I told you just a few minutes ago, Japan was modernizing in every way possible they could. I mean, going from a period of isolation and opening up, the Japanese were fascinated with what was going on in the rest of the world. They wanted to know as much as they could. And they had very friendly relationships with the United States. They wanted to be like the Americans. They wanted to be like the Europeans. They changed their dress, their habits. And like I said, they decided that they also wanted a representative form of government. But they did not have a tradition and a history of representative form of government. And the military, the Japanese military really became a problem in this regard because the Japanese Army and the Navy were convinced that the only way Japan would survive and not end up the way China had become was that they had to be strong. They had to get the necessary appropriations so that they could continue building up their navy and their army just in case they ended up having to fight for their very survival. So it'd be members of the parliament if they didn't, somebody voted against appropriations for the army and the navy, or if the prime minister said, no, you've had enough, we need some of the money for infrastructure or whatever. It was not unusual then for some hotheads in the military to go assassinate members of the parliament. At least 2 prime ministers, I believe, were assassinated by members of the military. This is before Pearl Harbor. Members of the cabinet, we had to be very careful. They had to be really, very careful. So from that point on, when the Japanese military said, we need this much money for more ships or this much money for the army, the civilians were reluctant to turn them down because they didn't want to be assassinated. Now, Japan in 1931 decided to go a little bit further. They moved into Manchuria. They did not get orders from Tokyo to do that. It was some general nobody had ever heard of who was over there and decided that he was going to make the move. And if Tokyo didn't like it, that was too bad. Matter of fact, I think that was one of the prime ministers. Once he found, or one of the prime ministers, when he found out this general had just taken over Manchuria without any orders from Tokyo, he got really upset. I think he was one of the ones that was assassinated. Because a lot of people think, well, Japan is such a disciplined society. Nobody does something unless they get orders to do it. But that was not the case. In the military, there were people out in the field who took actions on their own without orders. And that was one of the instances. But it was a fait accompli. And what really surprised the Japanese, that there was hardly any resistance from the Chinese. Part of this goes back to the fact that the communists under Mao Zedong and the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek were in a bitter civil war, and they were caught completely off guard about this. And what even surprised the Japanese more was by 1932, they had pretty much control of Manchuria, and they didn't have to have large numbers of troops there to control it, because there were people in China who would be perfectly happy to collaborate with the Japanese. So that worked out pretty well with them. But then, a few years later, in 1937, they decided to invade China proper. By this time, the communists and the nationalists said, maybe we better put aside our civil war and work together at least long enough to expel the Japanese. So that was a bit of a shock to the Japanese, too, because where Manchuria just fell into their lap, China proper decided they were going to resist. Now, their Chinese army was not as well trained and well equipped as the Japanese. They lost just about every battle. But they fought, and the Japanese seized most of the port cities, but they could never seize all of China. I'm going to go a little bit more into that in a minute. But by the time of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, because of the resistance being put up by the Chinese, they'd already lost 400,000 dead. That's approximately how many Americans died in World War II. And they'd already lost that many during the fighting between 1931 and 37 just in the Chinese mainland. Now, the United States was very isolationist. You see, we got dragged into World War I. Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, tried to keep the United States out of it. But he was eventually forced into it. We declared war in Germany in 1917. But we had to build up an army. We hadn't had a big army since the American Civil War. And we had to start building ships and everything else we needed. And by the time we got troops over to Europe, it was 1918. Most of the industry that was turned over to the production of military goods, a lot of it never even made it to France. We built submarines that really didn't fight in the war. We built ships that really didn't get involved. Matter of fact, when our troops got there, they were using French and British equipment for most cases. And they only fought for the last 6 or 7 months of World War I. But in those last 6 or 7 months, the United States lost 120,000 dead. Now, that's not as many as we lost in the American Civil War, but that was quite a few young men to die in such a short period of time. So after that, the United States, or the majority of people in the United States, were dead set against being drawn into any more foreign entanglements. So they became isolationists in their own right, not as severely as the Tokugawa shogunate, but we did not want to get involved in any more foreign entanglements. We didn't want to have to go over and bail out the French and the British again, let them figure it out themselves. So we were not prepared. We were not prepared for World War II. But the thing is, when World War II started in Europe, it brought the United States out of the Depression. Matter of fact, industry started up again. And why? Because we were building planes and ships and other things that the Allies needed, especially the British and later the Russians after the French surrendered to the Germans. So yeah, the war brought us out of the Depression. People were finding work again, but most of what we were manufacturing was going over to Europe. So 1939, war was declared in Europe. In 1939, the U.S. Navy had only 2 transport ships. We're not going to get in another war, so we're not going to start building up our own Navy yet. In 1940, the U.S. Army was 18th in the world, right behind Portugal. Matter of fact, the cavalry was still using horses and mules. I was at a military history conference in Canada some years back, and I met a guy who had just published a book on the history of Army mules. He said he'd been studying Army mules for the past 30 years. I asked him, I didn't ask him, but I was tempted to ask him if he'd been doing anything else besides study Army mules. But anyway, he wrote this book, and when I got up to leave, he said mules had been very good to him. I hope so. But here we are, Germany in 1940 under Hitler. 10% of the population is in the military, almost 7 million men, 136 divisions. The U.S. in 1940 had only about 500,000 men in the U.S. Army, about 5 divisions, and they didn't have much to fight with even if they had to go to war, because my father was in a National Guard unit in Illinois prior to enlisting in the Navy later. He said they would go on maneuvers and they took wooden guns and wooden machine guns, where they just didn't have anything to even to practice with. Now, things were getting pretty desperate in the Pacific too. So after the fall of France, the Japanese moved into what was then French Indochina. French Indochina is just to the west of the Philippines. The Philippines was the biggest overseas base that the United States had at the time. Roosevelt had already met with Churchill prior to Pearl Harbor, and they agreed that eventually the United States would probably get dragged into it, and they were making plans in advance for that eventuality. And then when the Japanese moved into French Indochina, Roosevelt decided he was going to move the Pacific Fleet from the west coast of the U.S. out to Pearl Harbor. He also was going to, freezing all Japanese assets in the United States, and eventually he cut off the exportation of petroleum products to Japan. Back in those days, the United States was a petroleum exporting country, and 80% of Japan's petroleum products came from the U.S. The Japanese pretty much concluded that if we can't get oil from the United States, we only have a year's left in reserve. And where are the nearest petroleum reserves closest to Japan? They were south of the Philippines in what was then British Borneo and the Dutch East Indies, mainly Sumatra. So General Marshall of the Army and Admiral Stark, who was then Chief of Naval Operations, went to the president and said, look, we're starting to build more planes and ships and this and that, but a lot of it's going to the British. He says, Marshall argued that even if we start drafting and bringing more men in the military, we won't be ready for one war, let alone two, until sometime in 1943. But FDR just wouldn't listen to it. He said in several of the biographies that have been written about it, he was trying to bring the Japanese to their senses. But the Japanese looked at it differently. They thought the President of the United States was trying to bring them to their knees. So what was the alternative? Well, Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Now, I've been to a lot of history conferences, and we're always talking about turning points in World War II. We talk about the Battle of the Coral Sea or Midway or this or that, but I went to a history conference in Canberra some years ago, and Richard Frank, who's an outstanding Pacific War historian, gave a little presentation. He says, if you look at World War II in its entirety, from wherever you want to call it the beginning, whether it was in Manchuria or when Hitler invaded Poland, the real turning point in the war was December 7, 1941, because the United States, up until then, was isolationist. But after Pearl Harbor, the United States was brought irrevocably into the war. And that was the real turning point. Because once the United States were in there, we had the industrial capacity to build what was necessary to defeat both Japan and Germany. But it was going to take a while, because we didn't have much of an army or navy at that time anyway. And I want to get back to China, because I think a lot of people, when they think about World War II in the Pacific, they're thinking about the Japanese fighting the Americans and their allies. They forget about how important China was. Because like I said, they invaded China proper in 1937, and they won just about every battle against the Chinese military. And they were able to seize most of the important port cities along the coast. But when they tried to defeat the Chinese army, even though the Chinese lost most of the battles, they couldn't. China refused to surrender. They would retreat further into the interior. And if the Japanese followed them, then their communications and supplies were stretched, and they were subject to guerrilla warfare that way. But just think about it. If China had ever surrendered, or if they had signed a peace agreement with the Japanese, releasing all the military personnel and their equipment that had been tied down there, the war in the Pacific for us might have been a very different situation. Now, I have a hard time finding exactly how many Japanese military personnel were tied down there. I've consulted a number of Pacific War historians, including David Frank, whose latest book, Tower of Skulls, investigated, trying to find out exactly how many Japanese military personnel were tied down in China. Now, some historians say it might have been 800,000 men. And another historian says it was over 2 million. But, you know, when I go try to find endnotes or footnotes. Where did they get these numbers? They don't exist. I think it's a wild guess. But I think it's fair to say enough Japanese soldiers were tied down on the Chinese mainland that it made victory in the Pacific against Japan possible. If all those Japanese soldiers had been released from fighting in China and were allowed to fight in other places in the Pacific, it would have been a completely different outcome to the war, I think. Now, Admiral Yamamoto of the Combined Fleet in Japan, he had lived in the United States. As a young naval officer, he had been Japan's naval attaché to the United States. He came back later and got his PhD at Harvard University. So he spoke English fluently. He had friends in the United States. He traveled widely. And he knew that if they ever got in a conflict with the United States was bigger than Japan, not just geographically, but in terms of natural resources and industrial capacity. He thought it was a bad idea. And there were others in the Japanese military who thought it was a bad idea too. They even conducted war games and study groups. They all came back with the same conclusion. We're going to lose. But there were forces in Japan that forced their hand. Yamamoto said, okay, fine. If we're going to go to the war with the United States, the only possibility of any success is if we destroy the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. And even then, I'll give you maybe 6 months. 6 months after we destroy the Pacific Fleet, we can do whatever we want. After that, all bets are off. Because he knew that by 1943, the United States would be able to build more ships and more planes, replace the ones that were sunk at Pearl Harbor, and build even more. And he was pretty much spot on, okay? Because if you think, there's December, that's when they bombed Pearl Harbor. That's December, January, February, March, April, May, that's 6 months. The Japanese were stopped at the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942 in their attempt to take Port Moresby on the south coast of Papua New Guinea. A month later at the Battle of Midway, they lost 4 of their aircraft carriers and a lot of their best pilots and mechanics when those carriers and other ships went down. So he was pretty much spot on. So from Midway on, even Coral Sea on, the game was up. The Japanese had been stopped, and from that point on, they were being pushed back. Now, what was the main U.S. contribution to victory? It was basically industrial output. I mean, we had 16 million men and women in uniform by the end of World War II. But our industry was such, protected on the Atlantic on one side and Pacific on the other, we could produce whatever we want without fearing that our industrial plant could be bombed or even invaded. So we were supplying not only the U.S. military with the equipment they needed, we were supplying our allies, the Australians, New Zealanders. I'd done a lot of oral history interviews in Australia and New Zealand. A lot of these people were flying PBY Catalinas, F-4U Corsairs, other American-made aircraft, and also a lot of the other equipment came out of the United States. So that was the main contribution, really. Even though we provided a lot of military personnel, it was the industrial output that really helped win the war. Now, like I said, though, we weren't going to get in another war, so we weren't building any more ships. We didn't have much of an army either. Matter of fact, the first U.S. battleship commissioned since the early 1920s was the USS North Carolina, and it took 3.5 years to build. So, I mean, if it's going to take that long to build a ship, regardless of the size, it would still be fighting in World War II. So, basically, we had to find a way of building everything faster and cheaper. And basically, that's what American industry did. So, in 1940, it took, on average, about a year to build a ship, whether you're talking about an aircraft carrier or a destroyer escort. On average, it took that long. By 1941, they got it down to less than 200 days, and by 1942, it took about 60 days on average to build a ship. And I'm talking everything from Liberty ships to aircraft carriers. So here we are, by war's end, the United States had built 10 new battleships, 90 cruisers, these are round numbers, by the way, 60 destroyers and 600 destroyers and destroyer escorts. Now, the destroyer escort was a new type of ship because we needed destroyers for a variety of things. Anti-submarine warfare, we needed them for anti-aircraft platforms and a variety of other tasks, but they took a little bit longer to build. They're a little bit more, they're kind of expensive, not like an aircraft carrier battleship, but we needed a lot of those, and we needed them now. So somebody came up with the idea of what I call the Volkswagen version of the destroyer. It was a destroyer escort. Served the same purpose, but it was smaller, slightly smaller, faster to build, and cheaper to build. We had 300 submarines by the end of the war. We had something like 140 aircraft carriers, okay? We started off with only 6. Now, they weren't all built from the keel up, and I don't want to go into too much detail on that because I have another lecture later on in the cruise about the role of aircraft carriers in the Pacific War. But again, remember, we started off with about 6. We had over 140, and a lot of these were given to the British. So in 1943, the U.S. war production was twice that of Germany and Japan combined. So Yamamoto was right. Get into 1943, we made up all of our losses from Pearl Harbor and some of the early fighting of 1942. By early 1944, an airplane came off the assembly line every 5 minutes. 8 aircraft carriers a month. Now, they weren't all, like I said, built from the keel up. A lot of them were, Henry Kaiser, for example, started building these little baby aircraft carriers. And they took other types of ships, just cut off the superstructure and put a flight deck down on them, and there you got an aircraft carrier. And 50 Liberty ships a day. I mean, we can't do that today. It's just too high tech. For example, Australia, they're going to invest in some nuclear submarines. Great idea. But you know when the first one will be ready to use? 2040. Might be a little bit too late. So I don't think we could do that today. So here we go. At the beginning of the war, Roosevelt told the airplane industry, I want 50,000 aircraft a year. And they said, that's impossible. These are not Model Ts. We're talking about precision parts and all that. He said, do it. I guess when you don't know anything about building aircraft and you're the president of the United States, you can say, do it. Somebody's got to do it. Okay. So here we are in 1944, and they built 90,000 aircraft in the United States alone that year. So production of civilian products was resumed in August 1944. Okay? We still had another year of the war to fight. That's not saying all of our industrial capacity was switched over to civilian production. It wasn't, but some did, because we had plenty of aircraft by then, plenty of ships, and so it worked out pretty well. Now, I'm getting towards the end of this lecture, but I want to throw this up here because this shows you the casualties we suffered in various wars going back to the American Revolution. And the bloodiest war in U.S. history was the American Civil War. Well, over 600,000 Americans died in the American Civil War. This is at a time when the population of the United States was only 35 million, okay? And that was the bloodiest war in our history. The second bloodiest war was World War II, where the population was, so I said for the Civil War 30 and 35 million, right? Okay, so World War II, I think it's somewhere around 130, 135 million. Now, in the American Civil War, when my great-grandfather was wounded, I had a great-uncle who died from cholera of that. And we get into World War II, still, it doesn't compare to what we lost in the American Civil War. Now, I come up to World War II, and I have to ask the question, how many people died in World War II? I mean, not just Americans, but worldwide. Because I remember when I was in high school, I remember reading a book, and it said, we think between 30 and 50 million people died in World War II. That's a hell of a lot of people, right? But it also says they don't really know. I mean, it's a big between 30 and 50 million. Well, since then, though, there are people who study the demographics of war, and they have pretty much concluded now they think at least 80 million people died in World War II. Not just from combat, but from disease and starvation and stuff like that. The Russians, they think, lost at least 30 million in Russia. Stalin didn't count very well. Just send them out there, and if they didn't come back, too bad. Over 20 million people died in China during World War II. So it leaves me now, though, in wrapping up this lecture, to ask you, if we were to have another conflict, similar to World War II, given all the countries that have weapons of mass destruction, how many of us would survive it? How many? If 80 to 100 million people died using conventional weapons in World War II, how many of us would survive? So, ladies and gentlemen, on that happy note, if I haven't ruined this cruise for you yet, come to my next lecture and I'll try to do a better job.